Hello, everybody, and thank you again for joining. We have participants from many different time zones, and I appreciate you taking out time of whatever time of the day it is. I wanted to gather together for a few minutes just to discuss the executive orders of President Trump. Of course, there have been many executive orders in just a few days of Mr. Trump's presidency, and they have impacted many different areas. And with regard to the immigration-related executive orders, the news is full of information about them, and I suppose that we could actually spend a couple of hours discussing the minutia of the various executive orders and their impact, but I thought it would be important to speak for a few minutes from the perspective of someone who's involved with business immigration in an employment type setting of the impact of the orders, what we know and what we don't know. Now, that's probably the first important point because there are many questions still, and as you can probably tell just from the various news media, this has been a developing story. I mean, sometimes regulations or laws are changed or policy directives are issued with all of their details. In this particular case, it came out very suddenly, and the agencies themselves who are implementing the order had to figure out what they were going to do, and that has caused a lot of confusion. So let's hit a number of issues that are in the news right now with regard to immigration. The first, which you may have heard about last week, is the wall and southern border between the United States and Mexico. From an immigration business perspective, this isn't particularly relevant. Most people involved in the world of business immigration are not necessarily in favor of people sneaking through one border to another, but the question of whether there should be a wall or shouldn't be a wall is a matter of resources and enforcement, and not particularly of a hot issue from a business immigration perspective. Also, another big issue is the refugee admission issue and the moratorium on refugees coming into the United States for a period of time and the indefinite stoppage of refugees from Syria. These, of course, are crucial issues in a larger American discussion, but doesn't have an enormous impact on business immigration and people involved with business immigration, except for the fact that we may have employees whose family members are impacted by this, and there will be issues of dealing with employees and stress in the workplace. But if we do employ refugees, there are people who are already here in the United States. The next issue, which we've heard probably the most about recently, is the travel ban. Essentially what the order says is that, well, we're trying to figure out how to deal with the security situation and to keep ourselves safe in the post-9/11 era, and therefore we're going to say that anyone who comes from countries that have been previously identified by the government to be on a particular list should not be able to enter the United States. Those countries, of course, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. Now, of course, this has a huge impact for these particular communities in the United States and for others from other places as well. But from a business immigration perspective, since there are an enormous number of employees from these countries, it's not something that everyone's going to deal with en masse, but it still does impact some people. For example, people who are green card holders who are citizens, for example, of Iran. We have a number of clients with people like that. Now, that's a good example of the way that the rules have been in flux. When you read the executive order on its face at the beginning of the weekend, it appeared that green card holders were going to be impacted by this. Afterwards, there was a statement on Sunday by the Department of Homeland Security that green card holders may not be impacted and generally would not be impacted by this. And yet, there's still some questions about exactly how that works, exactly how the airlines, when letting people on the airplanes, are going to treat this. And so, this still remains an issue of confusion. Now, you also may know that a number of federal courts have paused the ability of the Department of Homeland Security to actually remove or deport people under these circumstances. But there was confusion as to whether we're following the order or not following the order. And even if we're not following the order, and even if we can't remove people, that still doesn't mean that people are necessarily allowed to get a visa at a U.S. consulate abroad or allowed to get on a plane. And so there are many, many issues with regard to travel itself, even beyond what happens once you get to an airport in the United States. Another area of confusion has been the treatment of dual citizens. Again, initial guidance suggested that dual citizens would have a problem. The most recent guidance suggests that, well, it depends what passport you're traveling on. If you're traveling on, for example, a UK passport, and you also happen to have a Syrian passport, then you should be okay. But again, these are matters that there's a level of communication where a message comes out from Washington and then it needs to be interpreted by the agencies and by the airlines. So in practice, these people are having issues as well. There was also discussion about U.S. citizens. Of course, there are many U.S. citizens who are also citizens of one of these countries as well. Again, the latest is they shouldn't have problems, but maybe if they come back, they should have an issue. So this is always coming back and forth, and there's a lot of confusion, certainly within the government as well as for individuals. So in terms of takeaways from a business immigration perspective, I think just the obvious one is be very careful with international travel if you have some kind of connection to one of these countries. And even though lawful permanent residents have officially been told that they should be okay in most cases, and U.S. citizens as well, I would still recommend carefully reviewing the situation with a lawyer before allowing anyone to travel, because again, there's what the official rule is coming out of Washington, there are various versions of the rules, and then there's the way it is being interpreted in the actual airports. So anyone who really needs to travel needs to carefully look at that first and understand. There's another, I think, thing to keep in mind, which impacts us in the world of business immigration, and that is delays. Delays in airports, delays in secondary inspection. So while normally, when you come into the United States and you present your passport, they normally say, go ahead. But in many cases, they say, we have to check this out further. That's not necessarily a terrible thing, but there is a check this out further room, which is called secondary inspection. Now, secondary inspection may be a little more busy now than they are in other situations, and that could cause a delay as well. Another issue to take into consideration, which I think is important, will be processing delays in general, because, well, maybe we'll divide that into two parts. First of all, delays for people who are supposed to be getting immigration benefits who are part of the 7 countries. So let's say, for example, I am already in the United States, and I am a citizen of Iran, and I have an Iranian passport, and I am on an H-1B visa. In that type of situation, if I'm applying for another benefit, one of the latest news pieces is that they are possibly going to hold those cases in abeyance, meaning you can go ahead and apply, but they're not yet ready to adjudicate and decide those cases. So again, this has nothing to do with anyone entering the United States. This is someone who is already here, where this has now been an extension applied here as well. There has been discussion about how this applies to applications for naturalization. That means someone, again, who is a citizen of Syria and has a Syrian passport, living in the United States with a green card, perhaps for 10 years, who applies for citizenship. Now, those cases, as far as we now know, are going to be accepted, but whether they're going to be adjudicated and when and how, that is still a matter of concern. But even for people who are not part of those countries, there are issues in terms of delays that result of this. I'll give an example of an ancillary type of delay. Yesterday, the U.S. consulate in Toronto was closed. And the reason it was closed and not able to do any visa business was because there were protests. As you know, if you follow the world news, there are protests going on around the world. And so as a result of that, there's a slowdown in processing. And so these things can impact us in a lot of different ways, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And so the next, I think, key takeaway is that when we're looking at sending someone abroad to apply for a visa in their passport, or if someone is already abroad and they need to apply for a visa in their passport, we may have to adjust our expectations about the amount of time it would take to get that case adjudicated, because there may be delays at embassies and consulates now. Now, we don't have specific information about that, but it's important to keep that in mind. Our idea that you go in and a few days later you get it, in some cases may happen, in some cases not. Let me move to something beyond what's called the travel ban, which I think actually for sure impacts everyone. And that is, in the same executive order that discussed this travel ban and that discussed refugees, there was another very important note, and that was related to all of us, and that is the visa interview waiver. You may know that many people who are applying for a visa and have already had a visa recently, for example, someone who has an H-1B or an L-1, in some cases doesn't actually have to go for a full interview at the embassy. They can go into the country and then apply for a renewal by mail. Sometimes this is referred to as the drop box. And for some people, this is great because they don't actually have to go into an interview, which is a hassle for people depending on where they live. And it's worked out very well. And this has been utilized. Not everyone has utilized it because sometimes it may be faster to get an interview under normal circumstances. But a lot of people have utilized this drop box. Now, there's been a halt for now of the visa interview waiver program. So that means that not only can you not apply for a drop box, but it means that everyone who was applying through the drop box is now going through the regular consulate, which means it could take longer to get an appointment, especially in a place like India where the appointments were already quite backed up, and drop box for that reason was utilized quite heavily. So that's something, again, has nothing to do with the 7 countries. It's just an across-the-board halt of the visa interview waiver. Another thing which I think we're going to see in this respect is whether there's going to be additional security checks and vetting. This is something that we had post 9/11, where things started happening a little more slowly at consulates, at USCIS, because they were doing added security checks. And I think that's something that we can see on the horizon as well. So those are the areas that I think we see immediately out of the executive orders. But there is, I think, actually more that we can expect to come up on the executive orders, that some that have not come up yet and some that have been partially released. One of the things that they've spoken about in the executive orders is an increase in workplace enforcement. That means 2 things. It means that employers, of course, have an obligation to maintain Forms I-9 and to do a verification process. And one of the things that Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, does, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, is it visits employers. Maybe visiting is a nice way to say it. It audits employers, sometimes with notice, sometimes without, to ensure that their ship is in shape. And this is an area which we know, for example, that through the executive orders, they're already authorizing a very significant increase in the number of ICE agents. I believe they're adding 10,000 to what was currently 7,000, so that's more than twice the number. And while it will certainly take time to get them funded properly and hired and trained, these additional people, I definitely see that as an issue of concern. Along with that, of course, is raids. Some workplaces are raided by ICE, and we don't know exactly what the plans of the government are. They have not been specific about it, and these types of things are already happening, but we do know that the administration has basically said that it is going to shift deportation priorities, where pretty much everyone is a target, not just criminals. At least that's what the statements that have come out have said so far. So this is, I think, an opportunity and a warning for employers to ensure compliance. And again, it will take the government time to get up to speed in terms of training new agents and being able to do more. But that gives us as employers time to, as I said, make sure we've internally trained properly on I-9s, we've audited our I-9s, we've done everything we need to do in terms of moving forward with that. And I think that's something that probably everyone's got to start acting on now, because one of the things President Trump has shown is that the things that he talked about in the campaign, he really plans on doing. And so, there's still time to tell, but I think that it's a good guess that this is something we should be taking seriously at this time. Then, as I sort of alluded to before, there are executive orders which have not been published yet or are in the process that are being looked at. One of the issues coming up on the horizon there is something, again, the president spoke about in the campaign a lot, and that is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So under NAFTA, the agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, there's something called the TN visa. Now, if NAFTA is either they withdraw from it or they renegotiate it, we don't really know what that's going to mean for the ability to keep TN visas. And for that reason, I think probably we should be considering in this season of H-1B filings for the new H-1B cap, cases that will be filed on April 1st, 2017, to consider applying for H-1Bs for people who are in TN. Now, it's not going to be appropriate in every case, and as you probably know, there's a quote on H-1Bs, and many of the people who try to get in don't, because they only accept a certain number. But I think that's something to talk about, and you will hear employees bringing this to you as well as an issue of concern. Other issues that we expect, I think, to come up is the possible making of E-Verify mandatory. E-Verify is a government program which is sort of a souped-up version of the I-9, where after you complete the I-9, you then take key metrics and enter them into a government system. And right now, E-Verify is voluntary for most employers. There are some employers who have to do it because they're a federal contractor or because they have offices or do business with certain states of the union. But for most employers, E-Verify is voluntary. But E-Verify being mandatory has been pushed by the enforcement community for a long time. There isn't much objection either from Democrats or Republicans in Congress about this, and I would expect that that's something that we could see a change happening on, and I don't think that everyone has to start running out joining E-Verify because of that, but I think it's something to be aware of. In a lot of cases, I would counsel employers not to do it yet, but it's something that just I think is important to know about. Then there are also discussions about re-examining a number of the visa categories. Now, we don't exactly know what that means because what I'm expecting the executive orders that come out, they haven't come out yet, would say is something along the lines of, we have to take a close look at these particular categories. Just in terms of what's been leaked, it's nothing official. They've talked about the H-1B, they've talked about the L, intra-company transferee, they've spoken about the E visa categories for investors and traders, they've spoken about the B1 for business visitors. Now, exactly what type of reviewing and what's going to happen is not clear. Keep in mind, of course, that much of these very categories and the definitions and the details, much of it is tied up in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is a statute that only Congress can change. Indeed, if the president was able to change it that much, President Obama would definitely have made a lot of changes. One of the reasons he tried to do things and was limited is because he was bound by Congress. But I'm sure as part of looking at this, they'll look at what things the administration can do to reassess and perhaps tighten certain things up, make sure they're working the way they want them to be working, and on the other hand, what things they can work with Congress to do. So these are things that I expect will be happening in the next period of time that we'll start hearing about it, and we'll do our best to keep you posted as all these various changes take place. But again, I think the key takeaways is look at travel carefully, even for people who aren't from one of the countries, to make sure you're planning and allowing time for all the various things that could happen. Keep in mind that this is a time for working internally with human resources and internally to make sure that all of our I-9 records, our process, and our training is all up to speed and where it needs to be, and also to stay tuned for other updates that will come and see how they will really affect us. But I appreciate you joining in, and of course, we're always available for further updates and anyone who has to have a case-specific discussion. And I have a feeling that we'll be continuing to communicate one way or another under this world that we're navigating in a way that we can hopefully keep all our compliance things in shape and keep our employees calm and happy and working. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.